Hello, and welcome back to the Philip J. Curry Dinosaur Museum Virtual Speaker Series, where we have paleontology guests call in for a presentation on science, fossils, and dinosaurs, and where the public will be able to ask questions live on YouTube. For the viewers at home, you can leave your questions in the YouTube chat box, and I will read them to our speaker at the end of their talk. First off, we want to acknowledge that we are on the homeland of the many diverse First Nations and Métis people whose ancestors have walked this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to work, live, and learn on the traditional territory of Treaty 8. Today, Nathan Enriquez will be presenting his talk titled Tracking Dinosaurs in the Grande Prairie Area and the Paleontological Significance of Dinosaur Footprints. Nathan is a PhD student at the University of New England in Australia, whose studies have primarily focused on the dinosaur footprints preserved near Grande Prairie and their applications in reconstructing the Late Cretaceous dinosaur faunas of northern Alberta. In collaboration with the Boreal Alberta Dinosaur Project, including staff from the Philip J. Curry Dinosaur Museum, Nathan has conducted fieldwork at a wide variety of fossil localities in the Grande Prairie area. For his PhD project, Nathan is currently investigating the structure and preservation of dinosaur skin under the supervision of Dr. Phil Bell, Dr. Nicholas Campioni, and Dr. Christoph Hendricks. For those tuning in, you can type your questions in the comment section and I will read them to our speaker at the end of the talk. Thank you for joining us today, Nathan, and with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks for that introduction, Cam. And thank you everyone for tuning in, wherever you may be. So this work I did in collaboration with my two master's supervisors at the University of New England in Australia, Dr. Phil Bell and Dr. Nicholas Campioni, as Cam mentioned, as well in collaboration with an additional team of people from Canada, including from the Philip J. Curry Dinosaur Museum and the University of Alberta, who collectively form what we call the Boreal Alberta Dinosaur Project. We like to call it BADP for short. And this is a research group that predominantly focuses on the vertebrate paleontology of northern Alberta, particularly in the Grande Prairie area. And my master's project in particular has focused on a single dinosaur track site that I'll be talking about very shortly. Get the slide to advance, there we go. So I'll start by giving an introduction to footprints and why they're quite useful in a variety of paleontological studies. I'm sure most people here have been to the beach and observed their own footprints in the sand. And with dinosaur footprints, the concept is very much the same. They're simply much older and are now preserved within rock. So tracks generally fall into two main categories, depending on which side of the footprint you're looking at. The first main type in the very bottom left image is what most of us kind of think of as a typical footprint that's created as your foot presses down into the ground surface, forming a concave depression, which is called a natural mold. Whereas the other main type shown in the very bottom right image is called a natural cast. And this is the layer of sediment that came along later and filled in the mold, forming a 3D convex infilling. So if you then separate those two layers after the sediment has turned into rock, it gives you the concave mold on one side and the convex cast on the other. And both of these track types are present in the Grande Prairie area. A fairly straightforward but nonetheless important application of dinosaur footprints is that they tell us what types of dinosaurs were present at a particular area at a certain time, based on the fact that different groups of dinosaurs often had very differently shaped feet, often different numbers of toes that would have made impressions in the ground. And so this can kind of give you a broad indication of the dinosaur diversity in a particular area. And I say it only works at a broad level because closely related species tend to have more similar feet, and so their footprints can't really be distinguished precisely at a species level. Which means footprints are really usually used for determining diversity at higher taxonomic levels, such as family or above. But even so, this can be crucial for locations where dinosaur bones are absent from a particular area. So to illustrate this, the Gething and Gates formations of early Cretaceous age in Western Canada are extremely rich in dinosaur footprints, many thousands of which have been documented. But on particular layers, we have sometimes more than 10 types of dinosaurs indicated by their tracks, but none of them seem to have left behind any body fossils such as bones or teeth. So there's absolutely no trace of them except for these footprints. And this happens quite a lot. For whatever reason, bones might be absent from a particular area or geological deposit, and tracks provide really the only evidence that these animals were there at all, which is crucial for inferring what kinds of dinosaurs were present at this time, even in just a broad sense, given the complete lack of bones. Another thing we can do is to calculate the speed of the trackmaker. And this is work that was pioneered by zoologist Robert McNeill Alexander in the 1970s, who came up with this equation for calculating speed based on the stride length. So the distance between two consecutive footprints made by the same foot, and the estimated hip height of the trackmaker, which for bipedal dinosaurs he proposed was about 4 times the length of the foot. And while this almost certainly isn't perfect, the method is still widely used today for estimating dinosaur speeds based on trackways. So continuing with this overview of why dinosaur tracks are useful, they're very important for developing ideas of social behavior in certain dinosaur groups, as we often find multiple trackways that are aligned in the same direction as each other, suggesting that their trackmakers may have been traveling together in a social capacity. Of course, it's always possible that solitary animals simply walked across the same surface at different times, and so we look for additional pieces of evidence. For example, if the trackways are regularly spaced apart and they don't cross over each other, that more likely suggests animals moving side by side at the same time. The directions of travel should also be quite similar if they were moving together. So in the example pictured on the right here, the trackways next to the blue arrows are aligned, but they're going in different directions. So probably no interaction in this case. Whereas the trackways on the left are next to each other, they're going in the same direction, and they don't cross over. So this is much more likely to be two animals interacting with each other socially. And this sort of insight into social behavior is extremely difficult to determine using bones, which is definitely one of the key advantages of footprints, as they capture the real activities of these animals during their life. And lastly, footprints can't be moved by water or other animals like bones can. So when you find a footprint, that's a definitive link between the trackmaker and a particular type of environment. So you can say with certainty that this animal was inhabiting whatever environment is indicated by the type of rock, at least for that moment in time. As I mentioned before, bones can be moved, and so the rocks where you find them may not necessarily reflect the sort of environment that animal inhabited when it was actually alive. So footprints are really great in this way for testing hypotheses of palaeoenvironmental association, where you might infer that a type of dinosaur has a preference for certain environments if their footprints are particularly common in specific rock types. So for example, rocks that are derived from sediment laid down in river channels, tidal mudflats, or perhaps muddy swamps. So I'm now going to introduce the area in Canada that I focused on for my master's work, which is within a geological deposit called the Wapiti Formation. And this is the main sequence of rocks that produces dinosaur fossils in the Grande Prairie area. As you can see in the top right image, the formation covers a large portion of northwestern Alberta and a small portion of northeast British Columbia. The track site that I studied in particular is about an hour's drive from Grande Prairie. Collectively, the Wapiti Formation records the period of time between about 80 and 68 million years ago within the Late Cretaceous. the original depositional environment of the Wapiti Formation would have been dominated by river systems that kind of meandered across large floodplains. So it's a terrestrial freshwater deposit. And in recent years, especially, the diversity of fossil vertebrates recorded from the Wapiti Formation is known to be quite high, and includes various dinosaurs, crocodilians, turtles, lizards, amphibians, small mammals, and fish. And the significance of this formation is that it lies between a number of other dinosaur localities of similar age, both further north in Alaska and further south in southern Alberta and parts of the US. So it provides kind of a geographic link between dinosaur faunas across Western North America, which contributes to a much bigger picture of what was going on in terms of the evolution and biogeography of North American dinosaurs. In addition, the rocks of the Wapiti Formation are entirely terrestrial. So in other areas where marine inundations obscure the dinosaur fossil record, the interval of the Wapiti Formation remains open and it's fully terrestrial. So we're still able to observe kind of what's going on across these more predominantly marine intervals. Unfortunately, this part of northern Alberta is very densely forested. And so the main place where we can really collect fossils is alongside rivers, which cut through the strata and provide the best access to outcrops along their banks. So these are a few photos from some of the sites that we've collected at. On the right is a dinosaur bone bed, although at first glance it just looks like a giant heap of mud. And it's definitely messy fieldwork and often very tiring, as the banks tend to slip regularly. And so we're constantly having to dig away the mud that slumps down and covers the bones. And it's sloppy enough that when you go to toss it off your shovel, often it just sticks and does not want to come off, which makes it even more challenging. The other fantastic part about doing fieldwork out here is that you're never too far from the local wildlife. And I put this here because not only is it a great set of bear tracks, so very appropriate for this talk. These particular tracks weren't there the day before when we walked through this area to get to one of our sites. And then the next morning walking back, we noticed them. So it demonstrates why we're required to carry bear spray with us into the field. But thankfully, we haven't had to use any of it yet. So moving on now to my focal track site, which is named Tyrants Aisle and is located in northwestern Alberta, west of Grande Prairie, quite close to the border with British Columbia, along the Redwillow River. It's also about 8 kilometers away from a bentonite layer, which is derived from volcanic ash. And this can be dated radiometrically. So this particular layer, where the blue arrow is located in the center of the map, has been dated to roughly 72.58 million years old. And the Tyrants Aisle Tracksite is at roughly the same stratigraphic level. So this gives us a solid indication that the tracks date back to the late Campanian, about 72.5 million years ago. Because we are collecting alongside rivers, another major thing that we have to be aware of is the water level, which after heavy rain rises too high and just completely covers some of the sites that we work at. So this here, believe it or not, is the Tyrants Aisle Dinosaur Tracksite, completely covered by water. That particular day, we were there about a week too early. So here it is again, a few days later, slowly starting to emerge. And then finally in all its glory, with the water almost completely subsided, which usually only happens after periods of dry weather in the warmer months. So this here was in August 2018, but the following year in August 2019, the water level never dropped low enough for us to be able to access the site. So I only got a proper look that first year of my master's in 2018, which I'm very thankful for because I would have been in real trouble had the water level not been suitable that year either. I'd probably have ended up with a different master's project, but thankfully it all worked out in the end. The amazing thing about this site is that it's the largest in situ track site so far discovered from the Wapiti Formation, and it covers a length of more than 100 meters, and there's at least 100 tracks across that area. In comparison, most other tracks from the Wapiti Formation are single footprints found on usually isolated blocks of rock, which are much less useful for collecting the sort of paleontological data that I was talking about earlier. So this site is quite significant for the sheer size and abundance of tracks that it records in this area. As you can imagine, the fact that the river is flowing over the tracks for much of the year means that many of them are quite heavily eroded. And so there's considerable variation in track quality across the site, ranging from, at its worst, these kind of big round potholes that you can see in the foreground here, which probably represent former tracks, but they're now essentially just large eroded depressions. So getting slightly better here, this track isn't complete, but you can at least now make out the 3 main toes. So here it is outlined. And then at the other end of the spectrum, some of the clearer tracks that we have at the site, which are much more distinct. And I'll go into the types of dinosaurs that we've recorded shortly. But first, I'll talk about the documentation process. So the very first thing we did when we got to the site was walk around with pieces of chalk and circle any obvious tracks that we could see, like in the top left image. And we did this before setting up a baseline and a grid numbering system so that we could go meter by meter and sketch each of the tracks. As the site covers about 1,400 meters squared, this did take a long time, and there are certainly quicker ways to do this now using drones or LiDAR, but we opted in this case for the more traditional approach using hand-drawn grid maps, which were then digitized into a complete track site map on the computer, part of which you can see on the right. And this portion of the map only shows the first 33 meters of the track site, which should continue upwards to about 110 meters if it were complete, but it wouldn't fit on the slide without being really tiny. At one point during the mapping, because we were doing it by hand, a massive gust of wind did blow all the mapping sheets high into the air, almost into the river, which would have been a disaster, but thankfully we managed to get them all back. The lesson here being always weigh your field notes down, even if it doesn't seem that windy, because this just came out of nowhere. Another thing we did use was silicone rubber to mold some of the better tracks, as we didn't really want to excavate them. And so this at least allowed us to bring back a physical copy of some of them. And so the silicone rubber starts off as a runny liquid, as you can see in the bottom right image, which we pour into the footprints. And then after a few hours, that sets and we can peel them off again. So one of the most important tools for documenting dinosaur track sites is the use of photogrammetry, which basically involves taking lots and lots of photos of the track surface from all angles, and then using computer programs to stitch these photos back together to create a 3D mesh of the track surface. You can do this for individual tracks or even entire track sites, although the processing time and the file size will go up exponentially for larger areas, just because you require a lot more photos. Once you have a 3D track mesh, shown here in the middle image, you can then create what's called a digital elevation model. And this is where you can assign colors to the mesh based on their distance from a fixed plane. So in other words, you can visualize the topography, and usually we use cooler colors like blues and greens to show areas that are topographic lows, and warmer colors like yellows and reds to indicate the higher topographic areas. And this works really well for footprints because of their differing elevation from the surrounding surface. And it lets us see them really quite clearly. And in the last 2 decades, the use of photogrammetry for documenting fossil footprints has definitely become a staple method within the field. So this is an example of the benefits of photogrammetry that I always love to come back to, because it really shows just how much clearer it can make the tracks. So this footprint here, you should be able to see my mouse. This track here is quite clear in the digital elevation model and also in the photograph. But it wasn't until I got back to Australia and created this 3D model on the right that I was able to see this second track right next to it. So there's another big footprint here, which in the photograph you can see is almost non-existent apart from the tip of this toe here. We didn't even see this on site. So if I go back 2 slides, in the bottom right image, Robin here is actually sitting on the second track while we molded the other specimen. So it was almost invisible to us, but with photogrammetry like this, it stands out. And this meant that I was still finding new footprints on my computer months after coming back from the field, which was really awesome. So for the next part of this talk, I'll run through the different types of dinosaur tracks that we've discovered at the site, starting with the most abundant footprints, which belong to what are called Hadrosaurids. And these are large herbivores that are popularly referred to as duck-billed dinosaurs because of their elongate and somewhat flattened snouts. So the Hadrosaurid tracks can be identified by their very broad feet and 3 toes, which are also quite broad and which have blunt tips rather than sharp claw marks. The heels are either rounded, like the top example from Tyrants Aisle, or they may be bilobed, like the bottom example from southern Alberta. Most of the Hadrosaurid tracks at Tyrants Aisle are also quite large, between about 50 to 60 centimeters in length. And these are suggestive of animals that were probably between 2 and 2.7 meters tall at the hip. The largest footprint that we have was 67 centimeters long. Quite a big animal. And sometimes the Hadrosaurid footprints are also associated with smaller handprints. So going back again, this kind of round depression here where the mouse is, that's a handprint. And then again at the back of this footprint, this little round marking. So these indicate that at least some of the Hadrosaurids were walking on all fours. Other trackways at the site lack any sign of handprints, and so these may have been animals walking on 2 legs. And it also shows us that the hands of these animals were much smaller than the feet. So because of that, it's possible that many of the handprints have been eroded away by the river because they are much smaller and generally shallower. So very similar Hadrosaurid tracks are also known from southern Alberta, shown in the bottom image. And the ones at Tyrants Aisle share the same general shape characteristics. And so I've referred them to the same ichnotaxon called Hadrosauropodus. Just because footprints have to be different, there's an entirely separate naming system associated with tracks based on their overall shape. It doesn't mean both track types were made by exactly the same species. It's just a way of saying the morphology of the prints are more or less consistent. And so the example pictured at the top does have more of a rounded heel than the bottom example. But other examples at Tyrants Aisle also have this bilobed heel as well. So there's a bit of natural variation, it seems, within the ichnogenus Hadrosauropodus. I mentioned earlier in this talk that we don't usually assign footprints to a particular species of animal. And that's generally true. Sometimes you can make a decent case if the evidence allows for it. And so for our Hadrosaurid tracks at Tyrants Aisle in particular, they're very close to a mummified specimen of Edmontosaurus regalis, which you can see from the map here. was found only about 7 kilometers away on the same river, and at a very similar stratigraphic level as well. In addition, much further away in southern Alberta, within rocks of the lower Horseshoe Canyon Formation, which are about the same age, this species is the only identified Hadrosaurid. So all of this is pretty good evidence that the Hadrosaurids at the Tyrants Aisle Tracksite may have been individuals of Edmontosaurus regardless. Of course, we can never absolutely confirm this without a time machine, but it's a fair assumption to make given this contextual evidence. So earlier I spoke about using tracks to infer social behaviours, and we have some good evidence for this among the Hadrosaurids at Tyrants Aisle. There are 2 particular areas where Hadrosaurid tracks are aligned in the same direction and also spaced apart fairly well. So I would argue this likely represents herding behaviour. Interestingly, on the right, you'll notice that the track in the very bottom right corner is the only one facing a wildly different direction in this particular area. And there is a small handprint associated with this track. It's right where my mouse is here in the digital elevation model, and then again in the outline drawing. And this handprint overlies the tip of this other Hadrosaurid track, the one that was difficult to see on site, but was clear in the model. And so I think this tells us a bit of a time sequence for this particular herd, and it possibly explains why the animal at the very bottom was moving in a different direction, as it seems to have stepped over the top of this other footprint by placing its hand print over the top of the other footprint as it overlies this specimen, which is cool as it gives us a bit of a time sequence of events. And maybe this particular individual was lost or something, trying to find the rest of the herd. So moving on to the carnivorous theropod dinosaurs now. We have 2 trackways of small 3-toed footprints that are both aligned in the same direction and spaced about 1 meter apart. And so the tracks are all roughly the same size as well, about 18 centimeters long. And in this case, we have what we would call possibly pack behavior, given that these are carnivorous dinosaurs, which is cool, as it means we possibly have social behavior in the Hadrosaurids and some of the carnivorous dinosaurs as well. This type of small 3-toed theropod footprint is relatively rare across the 110-meter site. And in fact, the 6 that are circled here are pretty much all the ones we observed. So I think the fact that they're rather uncommon and to have 2 trackways side by side like this is pretty good evidence that these animals were walking together. We've also found track evidence of a group of small carnivorous dinosaurs called Troodontids. Unlike the previous track type, these dinosaurs only had 2 toes touching the ground, with the second digit raised off the ground, like in the reconstruction in the bottom right. We know that there were Troodontids in the Wapiti Formation dinosaur fauna because we found lots of their teeth at some particular sites, a few of which are pictured here, but anything besides isolated teeth is very rare within the Wapiti Formation when it comes to Troodontids, which is why the specimen pictured on the left side of the screen is a very important addition to the Wapiti track fauna. On the right is a 2-toed theropod track from China, which looks overall quite similar. Both tracks are about 10 to 12 centimeters long, but an important difference is that the relative length of the 2 digits differs between them. So in the Wapiti specimen on the left, the outer digit 4 is much shorter than digit 3. But in the Chinese example, the 2 toes, digits 3 and 4, are more similar in length. And this has been suggested by van der Lubbe et al. 2012 as a way to distinguish the 2 very similar dinosaur groups, the Troodontids and the Dromaeosaurids, based on observations of foot skeletons. Troodontids tend to possess a relatively shorter digit 4, while in dromaeosaurids such as Velociraptor, which we all know as the star of Jurassic Park, these two toes, digits 3 and 4, are usually about the same length. So we can say that the examples at Tyrants Aisle are probably Troodontid tracks, which makes them the first of their kind in Canada. And I've just recently published a paper on these in Geological magazine. And finally, the last group of dinosaurs that we've confidently documented and which gives the locality its name are the Tyrannosaurids, which were of course the large two-legged carnivores that were the dominant terrestrial predators within Western North America across the latter half of the Late Cretaceous. Once again, the story is similar to that for the Troodontids. Isolated Tyrannosaurid teeth are relatively common within the Wapiti Formation, but skeletal material is rare, which means we still haven't been able to pin down exactly what species of Tyrannosaurid is present here, but it's certainly not T-Rex, as these rocks are too old. More likely, they were probably made by Albertosaurus, which is fairly common within rocks of nearly equivalent age in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation of southern Alberta. But of course, with footprints, you can never really be certain unless you literally find a skeleton at the end of a trackway, which doesn't really happen, but I wish it did. It would definitely make things much simpler. So the Tyrannosaurid tracks at Tyrants Aisle are also quite large, up to about 60 centimeters in length, and they possess relatively more elongate toe impressions than the Hadrosaurids, as well as sharp claw marks, which allows us to distinguish these two track types. The heels of the Tyrannosaurid tracks are also a bit more V-shaped at the back, and the middle toe, digit 3, projects relatively further forward beyond the other two toes. So another of the interesting discoveries that we made at the site was this large theropod trackway, which probably belongs to either a juvenile Tyrannosaurid or possibly a very large ornithomimid, which are sometimes thought of as the ostriches of the dinosaur world. But it gives us a perfect opportunity to apply Alexander's speed formula that I introduced earlier in this talk. So we have what should be 4 consecutive footprints, although the third print in this case has been eroded away. Nevertheless, between the second and the fourth prints, we have a stride length of 2.6 meters, and the length of the most well-preserved track, number 4, is 40 centimeters, which gives us an estimated hip height of 1.6 meters. Based on this, the trackmaker was probably moving at a speed of about 7.5 kilometers an hour. For you or I, this would be a jog, but this particular dinosaur was only walking. In order to calculate the top speed, we would need to observe a full-on running trackway. But if you think about it, the amount of time in your life that you spend running pales in comparison to the amount of time that you spend walking. And so this means the odds of finding a running dinosaur trackway in the fossil record are much lower. And in fact, it rarely happens. So putting this all together, within the Wapiti Formation, we're seeing a dinosaur fauna that's clearly dominated by Hadrosaurids, so those herbivorous duck-billed dinosaurs. And this matches the relative abundance of Hadrosaurid body fossils within the Wapiti Formation, and also elsewhere across many other dinosaur faunas in Western North America during the Late Cretaceous. And so the map here is showing the location and diversity of other track faunas of similar age to Tyrants Aisle within Western North America. And Hadrosaurids are not only present every time, but they're most often the dominant track type as well. So their abundance within the Wapiti Formation seems to extend right across the continent, from the high polar latitudes in Alaska down to the warm, low latitudes of Mexico, telling us that Hadrosaurids weren't really favoring any particular latitudes and I think also demonstrating a high degree of adaptability. But keep in mind, we are talking about Hadrosaurids as an entire group here, and not any one particular species, which would be much more restricted in their range. Interestingly, there are a couple of types of dinosaurs that are conspicuously absent from Tyrants Aisle, but are known from body fossils within the Wapiti Formation. So these include Nodosaurid and Chylosaurs, like this guy in the middle, and also ceratopsids, which are the famous horned dinosaurs. And both of these dinosaur groups generally produce a 4-toed footprint and a 5-toed crescent-shaped handprint, which you can see on the left, for example. So their tracks are quite distinctive and should be recognizable if they were present at the site. Now for Nodosaurids, I can understand that we didn't find any of their tracks, as they do seem to have been quite rare within the Wapiti fauna. But in comparison, the ceratopsid Pachyrhinosaurus is very abundant within 2 distinct bone beds, which appear to represent mass mortality deposits where herds of individuals were all killed and buried together, perhaps as a result of flooding. These particular photos here are from the Pipestone Creek Pachyrhinosaurus bone bed, but there's another very similar one not too far away on the Wapiti River. And these 2 Pachyrhinosaurus bone beds are located quite close to the Tyrants Aisle Tracksite, as you can see in the map here. Not only that, but the tracksite sits between them stratigraphically and in terms of age. So Pachyrhinosaurus was clearly present in this area, both before and after the formation of the tracksite. And so you would expect to see its footprints at Tyrants Aisle as well. Interestingly, the sediments deposited at Tyrants Aisle are relatively low in organic content, such as plant material or fossil soils, and are made up of silts and fine sands, whereas a review of ceratopsid occurrences by Dave Eberth in 2010 found that ceratopsids generally favour highly organic and muddy wetland sorts of environments. So the fact that we don't see any ceratopsids at the track site could reflect this sort of paleoenvironmental preference for more organic and muddy sorts of environments. Although we'll need to collect more data from a wider range of track sites within the Wapiti Formation before we can really test this properly. Other possibilities might simply be a chance mismatch between the movements of these dinosaurs and deposition of the track layers. So essentially just bad luck. Or maybe the ceratopsids were only occasional visitors to the area and possibly passed through the Wapiti environment in these big herds, but didn't really stick around long term. Time will tell, and this is something that future work could certainly look more into. So to wrap up the main conclusions, fossil tracks can provide unique insights into dinosaur behaviour, speed, and paleoenvironmental associations, which act as complementary perspectives to the skeletal record. My focal locality in Western Canada, Tyrants Aisle, preserves the most abundant record of dinosaur footprints yet found within the Wapiti Formation, and includes tracks from Hadrosaurids, Tyrannosaurids, probable Troodontids, and other small carnivorous dinosaurs. In terms of sheer numbers, Hadrosaurids dominate the track site and the overall Wapiti Formation dinosaur fauna, which is consistent with their widespread ecological dominance across Western North America during the Late Cretaceous. And the fact that we don't see any tracks from horned dinosaurs like Pachyrhinosaurus, even though we know from body fossils that they should have been around this area at the time, may relate to a distinct paleoenvironmental preference for more highly organic, muddy environments, whereas the track site seems to pertain more to a kind of very fine sandy floodplain sort of environment. And I would like to thank all of my collaborators from the Boreal Alberta Dinosaur Project who helped out with fieldwork during our 2018 and 2019 field seasons, as well as my sources of funding for this project, which include the Australian Government, the University of New England, the Dinosaur Research Institute, and also the River of Death and Discovery Dinosaur Museum Society. I also want to thank the Grande Prairie Regional College, which provided lodging during our fieldwork seasons. After a long day's work in the field, it was great to be able to come back and cook a proper meal in comfortable housing. I definitely preferred that to camping in bear country. And finally, a big thank you to Cam Reed and everyone else at the Curry Museum for organising and hosting this online seminar. And I put these up just quickly so that on the recorded copy of this talk, anyone can follow up on some of the things that I've talked about. Otherwise, thanks everyone for watching, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nathan. That was an awesome talk. So like you
Thank you.
mentioned, we're going to move into the question period. And if anyone has any questions, they can type them into the YouTube chat section and I will read them to Nathan. So far, we have our first question. What future projects are you considering?
So personally, I've kind of switched topics at the moment towards dinosaur skin. So I'm working with the same supervisors that I had for my master's at UNE, Dr. Phil Bell, Dr. Nicholas Campioni, and also Dr. Christoph Hendricks. And we're kind of looking at the structure and preservation of dinosaur skin in general. Another thing I didn't mention in this talk, but sometimes you also do get skin impressions with tracks, so in the bottom of the footprint. And this is something that probably could have been at our site, except I suspect the river has eroded them away in this case. But certainly with the track site, there's definitely more directions to go with integrating the entire ecology of the Wapiti Formation. So for example, exploring the apparent absence of the horned dinosaurs that we had, and possible palaeoenvironmental preferences in certain groups, which is something that's already been suggested, for example, by Lyson and Longrich, that Hadrosaurids may have favored kind of sandier environments and ceratopsids possibly more muddy sorts of environments. Yeah, but I'm really excited to pick up work on skin, and I'm very keen to see where it takes me. I've only just started my PhD in the last couple of months, so it's early stages at this point. But yeah, I'm very much looking forward to it.
Both sound like incredibly interesting projects, and definitely a wide variety of researchers out there to tune in.
Yeah, let's just hope international travel comes back so I can go and see things in person. That would be nice. Fingers crossed for next year.
Yeah. Our next one comes in from Alexander Clark from YouTube. Since the predicted overall weight of theropod dinosaurs can be difficult to determine due to the pneumatic nature of their bones, can tracks help us determine the actual weight of these animals? Good question.
Yeah, so I guess there's a range of factors that you'd have to consider in doing that sort of work. For example, like the ground consistency, whether they're stepping on firm sand, loose sand, mud, because these different kind of substrates will greatly affect the depth of the footprint. So it would be kind of hard to try and definitively link footprint depth to animal weight. I suppose if you had a sample of tracks that were all from kind of the same surface with no variation in ground consistency or anything like that, possibly you could make an argument in that case. But then there's also the movement of the animal to consider. So maybe different animals going at different speeds might leave different footprints in terms of depth. And even the gait of the animal could possibly affect the depth. So it's an interesting idea. There would just be a lot of kind of factors that you'd have to work around in doing that sort of work.
That would be a difficult one to prove. There's so many variables.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we do have another one from YouTube, Jason Gilchrist. Hi, Nathan. Thanks for the great talk. Can you talk a little bit more about the photogrammetry process? How many photos would you take a single footprint, and what angles to produce a DEM?
Okay, yep. So if you wanted to make a model of a single track, you could probably get away with, say, 30 photos, and you'd want to take them so that you kind of circle around the whole specimen to try and capture kind of like a 360-degree range around the footprint. You don't have to get every single angle because the computer is actually pretty smart in putting those photos together and filling in kind of the gaps. But yeah, just kind of make sure you photograph around the full perimeter of the track and that there's overlap between each image. And yeah, you can usually do that with about 30 photos for a single track. As I mentioned in the talk, if you want to do a whole track site, then suddenly many more photos are required. And that's when you start getting huge file sizes and long processing times. So most of the tracks that we turned into 3D models, we actually just did as kind of single models of different tracks. Yeah, we tried to put together a whole reconstruction of the 110-meter site, but it just came out as a mess because there was over 7,000 photos that we had, and the computer struggled to put all that data together. So breaking it down into smaller chunks certainly helps.
I can imagine. If you use drones, do you have to take less photographs, or can it be
I'd say so,
same?
yes.
Yep.
Yeah, drones would definitely streamline the process. We didn't have that available to us at the time, so that's kind of why we opted to doing hand-drawn grid maps of the specimens and taking conventional photos.
Great idea. Here's another question from Audio Addict. Given how much theropod morphology changes as they age, how much does their foot shape change?
Excellent question.
Yeah.
I've actually got a paper coming out very soon that tackles this problem, and specifically looking at the Tyrannosaur tracks. So it does seem like as some dinosaurs grew, they become relatively more robust, more bulky, and that can be reflected in their footprints, definitely. So kind of you might expect to see slender foot shapes in some of the juveniles versus more robust and kind of fleshy prints in the older animals. And as the paper talks about, there are a number of caveats that you have to consider, so that you are looking at footprints of the same type of animal consistently across those different age classes, and also that the substrate, so the sediment that's actually being walked on, hasn't influenced those footprint shapes too much, as well as the motion of the trackmaker. So again, with this kind of work, there's a lot of angles to consider, but it hasn't actually been looked at in a lot of detail previously. Ontogeny, so growth that could be observed in footprints, and that's certainly something that my upcoming paper addresses. That'll be coming out in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, hopefully later this month.
That sounds like an area of research that needs to grow.
Yeah, yep, absolutely.
Here's another question from Eileen Vanderkoof. Are there other areas of dinosaur behavior that you think the study of tracks could shed light on that haven't already been studied?
I'd say definitely. Most of the time when it comes to behavior, it is looking at sociality, as I kind of talked about in the talk, generally because that's the most common sort of behavior that does get recorded in the fossil record, so aligned trackways. But there have been less common instances where footprints could be used to maybe suggest sort of hunting behavior, or has been suggested as possible hunting behavior. And also potentially even displays, like mating displays, kind of ritualized behaviors associated with courtship that possibly you could infer from footprints. But this kind of work is often hard to prove, again, because footprints are ambiguous by nature. But certainly they could provide insight into that sort of stuff if you have sufficient kind of evidence to support that argument. So you'd be looking at a decent sample size, hopefully, to suggest that kind of behavior. Yeah, it is tricky though, and it's something that should be explored further, because it's possible we're missing certain behaviors just because we're not expecting to find them. And so keeping an open mind, I guess, would certainly help interpret what we're actually seeing in these trackways.
Certainly. One more question. Can footprints be preserved in paleosols? If so, whereabouts have they been?
I haven't worked particularly with tracks in paleosols. I haven't, especially not in Grande Prairie, I haven't looked at those particular deposits. I'd imagine they could be. The examples that I can think of, I can't exactly remember where they would be. I'm sure there are instances where paleosol tracks have been found. And again, that would be a good indication of kind of which sorts of environments these particular track makers were living in, especially if you can reconstruct the original depositional deposit of that paleosol. But yeah, that's something that I haven't seen myself in the Grande Prairie area, but yeah, just needs more exploration. I'm sure they're out there.
Absolutely. I don't believe I'm seeing any more questions roll in. So I want to thank Nathan again for an excellent talk. And this will conclude our question period. For those watching, join us again Saturday, March 27th at 12 p.m. as Dr. Greg Funston will be giving a talk from Scotland on baby Tyrannosaurs from Alberta and Montana, aligning with the new recent discovery of embryonic Tyrannosaur material. Thank you again, Nathan, and thank you to everybody for joining in, as well as for sending in questions.